Hey everybody, MS Farzan here, and in this video we're going to discuss how to create a magic system. We're going to be drawing upon a couple of tried and true sources for this topic, so I'm going to direct you towards Brandon Sanderson's Laws of Magic and Philip Athens' The Guide to Writing Fantasy and Science Fiction, which I think is actually really helpful in a lot of different ways when you're considering world building or plot development or things of that nature for science fiction and fantasy writing and any type of writing really. And I'll link both of those sources in the description below this video. Suffice it to say that developing a magic system takes a bit of time and effort to really think through how the magic is going to interact with the rest of your world and how it is incorporated in your storytelling and in your things like plot devices and your character conversations and dialogues and etc. The first thing you're going to want to think about is, what is the source of your magic? Where does the magic come from? Is there some sort of font of magic that is at the center of the biggest town that people draw their magic from? Or is it a naturally occurring source? Or is it something more esoteric like the weave in Dungeons and Dragons fiction? Thinking about where the source of your magic comes from is going to influence everything about your magic system. And even if the source is not explained directly to the readers, like in Alice in Wonderland or in The Lord of the Rings, if you know where the source is of your magic system, where all the magic comes from, where all the spells are derived from, what is the backstory of where the magic in the world comes from, it's going to influence your world building as a whole, and it's going to inform how your magic system works. Which leads to the second point, and I think is actually even more important than the source, is creating a framework for your magic system. This draws heavily on Brandon Sanderson's Laws of Magic, where limitations are more interesting than the power of your magic system. If we think about a framework for your magic system, that means if you can think about the mechanical limitations and the mechanical framework for how your magic actually works, it's going to be much more believable for your reader and much easier for them to suspend their disbelief and think, wow, this magic system could actually happen. This could actually work. And the physical capabilities or metaphysical capabilities of this magic system might be pretty fantastic, but I'm able to see the inner workings of how this magic works and why it influences the world in the way that it does. If you're writing a more soft magic system like Alice in Wonderland, or if it's more epic magic like something you'd find in The Lord of the Rings or in the books of based on the Shannara series of Terry Brooks, you might have a window into how the magic works and into the source of the magic simply by how the characters enact that magic, how they cast spells or do epic things, and you might not reveal to the reader specifically how that magic works. But you, as the author and as the world creator, need to know the inner workings of that system and create a framework for how the magic works in your world. So it might be that every character, every spellcaster, or every warlock, or every witch has to return to that magical font in the middle of the city, the biggest city in the realm that you're creating. And the longer that they're away from that font, the less powerful their magic is. Or it could be perhaps that in your world, magic users are able to summon different beings from other planes, and other planes of existence. And if the way that they do this is, let's say, grinding up fairy dust and mixing it with water. And when they grind up a little fairy dust, they can summon a goblin for, let's say, a couple of minutes or an hour. And when you're able to create a framework for that, then you're able to extrapolate and say, well, if I want to summon an ogre instead of a goblin, then I need to grind up a lot of fairy dust, or I have to have a special type of fairy dust, or I need to use alcohol instead of water. And creating that framework allows you to have an internal logic to the system that will lend to your storytelling and make it more believable, so that the reader can say, you know, I understand this is a fantasy setting, and probably I can't find fairy dust in the real world and grind it up with water and summon a goblin. But if I were in a world in which there's a source of magic that allows me to do this, then I'm much more able to follow along with the story and much more able to be convinced by the storytelling that this is plausible in this world that has been created for me. You can think of this framework as things like using a fetish to cast magic, so that I need to have a special like a wooden toy that allows me to cast my magic, and if I don't have that wooden toy, I'm not able to cast magic. Or it could be that I need to actually have a physical piece of the magical source. Like, let's say the only way that I'm able to cast magic is by having this special ooze that I carry around with me in a pouch, and when I run out of that ooze, I can't cast magic. Or it could have to do with the scale of magic that I can cast, based on the amount of materials that I have available to me. So if I have a little bit of fairy dust, I can cast a little bit of magic, but if I have a ton of fairy dust, I can cast a ton of magic. And this leads us to the third thing that you need in creating a viable and plausible and exciting magic system. And I know this isn't going to sound very exciting, but what you need is consistency. And this is drawing heavily on Philip Athens' guide about how to create magic and how to use magic in your fantasy setting. You need to be consistent with how your magic system works. So if you listen to Philip Athens, which I think is a good idea, your protagonist in your fantasy series, if they can't cast a big fireball spell on page 1 of your book, they shouldn't be able to cast fireball on page 200 of your book unless they've gone through a process that allows them to learn a much more powerful spell throughout the course of the 200 pages of your book, or however long it is. It doesn't make sense for them to all of a sudden be able to cast this huge spell that wins the day and counters the machinations of the antagonist on page 200 if they weren't able to do it when they were tied up by the antagonist on page 125. It just doesn't make sense, and it kind of takes the place of a Deus Ex Machina where all of a sudden a character is able to do something that they weren't able to do previously. I have some issues with this in The Lord of the Rings, even though it's one of my favorite series and and essentially the series that inspired me to become a writer and an author and to create my own magic system and my own world. But when Gandalf shows up and does some really cool stuff, I'm kind of like, where was this cool stuff earlier in the book? Or how does this cool stuff work? Or what's the source of his power? And if you've read only The Lord of the Rings, you might get some of that. But if you haven't read all of the other stuff like the Silmarillion and all of the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien that are outside of the Lord of the Rings proper books, you might be scratching your head and thinking, where does all this magic come from? Now, in those books, that might not be as important because the storytelling is so cool, the world building is amazing, the languages, the characters, the races, everything is so up front and center, and it's such a low magic setting that the consistency of the magic isn't as important as everything else. But for your book, for your world, for your adventure, you might want to think about being consistent with your magic system so that you have this framework to rely upon that itself is based on a source of magic, and you stick to that throughout your novel or throughout your adventure or whatever it is you're writing, throughout your series of short stories, so that the reader, once again, can relate to the magic system and finds it plausible, finds it viable, and finds it more interesting when you use the magic system that you've already set up in that first 200 pages to do something they may not have thought about with the magic system at the end of the book, and it could be a plot device that you're working with, but not something that is so out of left field that they feel like it doesn't make sense, that it takes them out of their suspension of disbelief, and they're starting to say, well, it kind of feels like you just did that to move the plot forward, or you just did that because you didn't have a better way to resolve the story. If you have a framework and you have a source for your magic system, and you stay consistent with it, then the magic becomes almost like a set piece or a character itself, or something that you can interweave throughout the plot of the story that helps enhance the world building of your story and makes it more interesting without taking your reader out of the experience that they're having and requiring them to just buy into these different things, different magical occurrences that you're peppering into the story that really don't make a lot of sense within the larger context of the story. Again, if you're writing a more soft magic based novel or series, something like Alice in Wonderland, that where the magic doesn't need to be explained and it is more to wrap the storytelling in this warm blanket of fuzzy awesomeness, then that's one tactic. But I highly encourage you as the author, as the writer and the creator of this magic system and of this world, to know what is the source of that system, know what is the framework, and to be consistent with it, even if you never tell the reader exactly how the magic system works. I'm a big fan of systematized magic, where you have this whole system of magic that works and it's internally consistent and it's logic and it's, in a sense, play tested. Like you've treated it almost like a video game or a role-playing game's magic system, and you have an idea of the relative powers of spells, and you have an idea of how the spells should be cast, and whether or not they need somatic or physical components that have to be enacted when you're casting spells or when you're summoning a monster or enchanting another person. I think that's much more interesting, but I don't think it's necessary to tell a story that involves a magic system. What is necessary is for you to know the source, for you to know the framework, and for you to be consistent with it so that the reader can follow along and is with you on the entire journey. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe to my channel and follow me on Twitter for more crunchy content.